story, none of this could have happened. You and I wouldn't be talking today. So, of course, skill counts. You know, there's plenty of fantastic entrepreneurs who, you know, failed, who had wonderful skills, but just didn't have good luck.
This small little hippie like yogurt thing that you started in 1983 has made you very wealthy. I mean, first of all, was that ever important to you? Did you always want to become rich out of this?
All I wanted was my mother and my mother-in-law to get their money back.
Yeah.
I kid you not. No, look, you know, we began this interview by talking about my father and his failed business and all the tragedy that came of that with all the people in my communities. And, you know, I was never a believer that making money was the holy grail. You know, I sit on many boards now. I work with Wall Streeters, and look, I know the best way to convince these guys to invest in organic and renewables is to show you can make a lot of money. So,
and that's really what you did. I mean, despite all these obstacles you guys faced.
yeah, I often joke that we had a wonderful company just listening by no demand. No one knew that there was such a thing as better yogurt, and certainly no one knew what organic was. And yet, it's interesting that my dad and my mom, by the way, in both cases, what I now realize I got from them was this belief in myself that it didn't matter what was going to happen. If yogurt cups were leaking, if stores weren't accepting us, if competition was coming on, if I couldn't meet payroll, you know, there was always going to be a way. And I learned that from both of them.
And your mother-in-law, is she still around?
Sadly, she just passed a couple months ago.
I'm sorry to hear. I'm assuming that her $1 million was, in the end, a very good investment.
She did extremely well. She and I still kept secrets. She passed at nearly 97, and I can tell you that the risk she took with Stonyfield was probably one of her greatest points of pride. You know, she and Meg used to always have this conversation, and Meg, begging and pleading her mother not to invest in Doris, always had this one line which she had for decades, which is, "Meggie, I'm a big girl. I know what I'm doing. It's gonna work out." And she was right.
Gary Hirshberg, co-founder of Stonyfield Yogurt. By the way, Danone sold Stonyfield to another company called Lactalis, one of the biggest dairy companies in the world. And the amount Lactalis paid for Stonyfield? $875 million, which is not bad for a yogurt business that began with just one cow. Thanks for listening to the show this week. If you want to find out more or hear previous episodes, you can go to howibuiltthis.npr.org. Our show was produced this week by Jed Anderson, with original music composed by Ramteen Arablouei. This hour of How I Built This and Planet Money was produced by Terry Thompson. I'm Guy Raz, and you've been listening to How I Built This.
journey down the Great American Chili Highway. And later we make hearty beef stew from central Mexico. I'm Christopher Kimball. This is Milk Street Radio from KRX, coming up after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Louise Schiavone. Democrats in Congress predict impeachment investigations will move quickly to consolidate their findings over a course of weeks, they say, not months. NPR's Carrie Feibel has more.
The House Intelligence Committee could begin hearings in the coming days on the unfolding Ukraine scandal. Congressman David Cicilline is a Democrat from Rhode Island and spoke to NPR.
This is not going to require, months and months and months of hearings.
Cicilline says compared to the Mueller investigation, what happened with Ukraine is fairly straightforward.
The President of the United States pressured a foreign leader to target a political opponent to help him in his re-election and then tried to cover it up.
Cicilline sits on the Judiciary Committee, which would bring together multiple House inquiries and decide to formally draw up articles of impeachment. President Trump denies any improper or illegal contact with Ukraine. Carrie Feibel, NPR News, Washington.
Former U.S. Ambassador Joseph Wilson has died at the age of 69. He famously challenged the reasoning behind the 2003 invasion of Iraq. His ex-wife Valerie Plame says Wilson died in hospice care of organ failure. We get more from NPR's Amy Held.
Some saw Wilson as a righteous whistleblower. Others saw a political enemy. In 2002, the CIA sent Wilson to Niger to see if he could uncover evidence Iraq bought uranium for nuclear weapons. He didn't, and he said so. Days later, his then-wife, Valerie Plame, was unmasked as a CIA operative. Sean Penn portrayed Wilson in the movie Fair Game.
Those in the highest office sought to destroy the career of a public servant to punish me for telling the truth.
In a 2010 interview with NPR, Wilson reflected on his real-life role.
We owe it to you to make sure that we never again send you to die and kill in our names without fully understanding as a nation what it is we're asking you to do and why we're asking you to do it.
White House aide Scooter Libby was convicted in connection with the Plame leak. President Trump pardoned him last year. Amy Held, NPR News.
The CDC and the FDA have warned Americans to avoid e-cigarettes, but as Vicky Barker tells us, UK health officials disagree.
The UK is the world's #2 market for e-cigarettes after the US. British public health officials acknowledge that more research into the products is needed, but their current guidance is that vaping is about 95% less harmful than conventional cigarettes, and doctors have been encouraged to prescribe e-cigarettes to some smokers as a gateway towards giving up nicotine entirely. Public health authorities say there is no evidence any British vapers have suffered the same acute reactions experienced by some of their U.S. counterparts, perhaps in part because the UK has much tighter rules on the quality and nicotine content of vape pens. For NPR News, I'm Vicky Barker in London.
This is NPR News in Washington. There are some hints of slower economic growth, but Steve Beckner says Federal Reserve officials are not showing any eagerness to cut interest rates further.
The Fed has twice cut the key federal funds rate a quarter point to guard against trade and other risks. President Trump has urged the independent central bank to slash rates further, but Fed officials seem to be in no hurry to do so. Even after Commerce Department reports showed softer business and consumer spending, the Fed Board's Randall Quarles acknowledged global uncertainties, but called the economy quite solid. Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank President Patrick Harker predicts GDP growth above 2%, with unemployment staying below 4%. He said the Fed should hold firm on rates for now and watch how events play out. For NPR News, I'm Steve Beckner.
There was a clash today in conservative eastern Poland between LGBT pride marchers and far-right demonstrators. Police used water cannons and pepper spray and detained dozens of the counter-protesters at the Equality March in the Polish city of Lublin. A very private farewell is slated today for one of Africa's most divisive figures. Longtime Zimbabwean leader Robert Mugabe is to be buried at his rural home after a family dispute with the government administration that forced him from power. In local tradition, funerals are free for all to attend, but after a dispute with the government over where Mugabe's remains would be placed, only approved guests and funeral parlor bands will be allowed in. I'm Louise Schiavone, NPR News, Washington.
Support
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Walton Family Foundation, where opportunity takes root. More information is available at waltonfamilyfoundation.org. And the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
This is Mill Street Radio from PRX. I'm your host, Christopher Kimball.